Tons of lateral raise variations exist. You can perform it in different planes. No, I'm not talking about aeroplanes, but rather the plane of movement. Lateral raises can be done in the frontal or scapular plane. You can vary the bend you have in the elbow and hips. You can perform it with a neutral, internally, or externally rotated upper arm. You can also perform it with different equipment, dumbbells, machines, and cables. How do various muscles contribute to shoulder abduction at different stages in the frontal and scapular planes? In both these planes, in the initial abduction stages, 0 to 30 degrees, the supraspinatus tends to have the largest leverage, followed closely by the side delts, and then the front delts. In the middle abduction stages, from 31 to 90 degrees, the supraspinatus's leverage rapidly drops off, and the side delts display the greatest leverage, with the front delts fairly close behind. In the final stages of abduction, beyond 90 degrees, the supraspinatus has barely any leverage, while the side delt and particularly the front delt, especially in the scapular plane, see increasing leverage. At this stage, the side and front delts appear to have fairly comparable leverages. Other muscles like the infraspinatus and teres minor have much smaller leverages throughout all stages. What does all this information mean for lateral raise execution? Strictly speaking, this data may suggest lateral raises in the range of 30 to 90 degrees of abduction may be the best way to isolate the side delts, since below 30 degrees the supraspinatus are highly involved, while above 90 degrees we appear to get relatively more involvement of the front delts. However, I think for most people performing the exercise roughly between 0 to 90 degrees is perfectly fine. The exercise is still very challenging beyond 30 degrees, which is where the side delts have predominantly the best leverage. When directly comparing lateral raises in the frontal to scapular plane, it's evident the leverages of the muscles are more or less similar. Some may be wondering about the traps. No, not those traps. I'm talking about the trapezius. The traps will naturally be activated during shoulder movement. There's currently no data I'm aware of that can inform us of how trap involvement may compare between different lateral raise variations. Nevertheless, feel free to experiment around with the different planes and even variations to find your preference. Interestingly, quite a lot of people actually report that lateral raises in the scapular plane feel better for them. Some lateral raise variations, such as dumbbell lateral raises, enable you to use internal or external rotation, as opposed to the standard neutral upper arm. Internally rotating your upper arm with lateral raises likely enhances recruitment of the rear delts, while externally rotating your upper arm likely enhances recruitment of the front delts. In fact, a 2020 EMG analysis by Corratella supports this. If you followed the House of Hypertrophy for a while, you actually know I'm critical of surface EMG studies, since it has numerous limitations and there are examples where it simply fails to predict muscle hypertrophy outcomes. Nevertheless, I think these EMG findings are pretty logical, and using surface EMG to compare subtle changes with the same exercise may be potentially more reliable compared to using EMG for comparing different exercises. Nevertheless, I'd recommend individuals stick to a fairly neutral arm position if the goal is triggering max side delt hypertrophy. Some individuals may like to slightly bend at the hip during lateral raises. Some may also like to have a slight bend in their elbow. I'm unaware of any solid research that provides insight into whether these provide any meaningful benefit or not. I will mention it's likely that excessively bending the elbow will only further enhance front delt recruitment, so avoiding excessive elbow bending is probably sensible if the aim is to target the side delts. Ultimately, feel free to experiment with bending at the hip or elbow to examine what you prefer. Lateral raises can be performed with dumbbells, machines, and cables, and there are even lying and leaning variations. At the end of the day, these fundamentally all involve shoulder abduction and thus are all going to be great for evoking side delt hypertrophy. It's currently not clear if any of the subtler differences between them could impact hypertrophy. One potential difference relates to resistance curves. Dumbbell lateral raises involve fairly minimal tension in the initial stages of abduction, while cable lateral raises involve more consistent tension throughout the abduction range of motion, so the side delts are loaded more at the stretched position. Remember, the supraspinatus is highly involved in abduction in the initial stages, but the side delts are still going to be involved well in these initial stages. The reason I bring all this up is that in recent years, the literature indicates that exercises that train muscles in a stretched position tend to build muscle faster. There currently aren't any studies demonstrating this with the delts, but some individuals have used research looking at the operating range of the side delt sarcomeres to speculate this muscle should indeed benefit from stretch. However, I believe there are a range of limitations with research looking at the operating range of a muscle sarcomeres to the point where I don't think it's that useful for informing us on whether a muscle will truly grow more with exercises attaining a stretch. Nonetheless, hopefully we get future research examining how the side delts respond to stretch. It's possible that cable lateral raises could very well be slightly better. This is not to say dumbbells are useless. Again, at the end of the day, these all involve shoulder abduction and thus are all going to be great for developing the side delts. In fact, with the dumbbells, you could experiment with partial range of motions in that initial position. You won't be able to attain as great of a stretch as you can with cables, and we know the supraspinatus is also going to be trained well in this range, but this somewhat lengthened side delt dumbbell loading might still be great for developing the side delts. For example, we've previously analyzed this study by Pedrosa at the House of Hypertrophy, which found that partial range of motion leg extensions in the initial position, which far from maximally stretches the quads, but still trains them at a more lengthened position, produced overall greater quad hypertrophy versus full range of motion leg extensions. So perhaps partial range of motion lateral raises in that initial position are also great. Another option is that you could perform your dumbbell lateral raises normally with repetitions to failure, and then immediately perform additional reps with a partial range of motion in that initial position. Feel free to experiment around. If you prefer to keep things simple, just select whatever lateral raise variation you prefer. Once again, all of them fundamentally involve shoulder abduction. Finally, within the same program, or across many months of different training cycles, you can of course vary the type of lateral raises you train with. Lateral raises are one of those exercises where you're never going to be lifting super heavy loads. Trying to go heavy can result in people using excessive momentum with poor technique. Don't be afraid to use lighter loads. We have a multitude of studies demonstrating that provided you're performing repetitions to or near to failure, reps between 6 to 35 can be similarly effective for building muscle. Moreover, you don't need to worry about trying to increase the load you lateral raise with every session, week, or even couple of months. Progressively overloading through increasing the number of reps you perform across workouts with the same load can be perfectly fine. We've previously analyzed a 2022 study out of the USA that found across 8 weeks, progressively overloading through increasing the number of reps you perform with the same load was as effective for building muscle to progressively overloading by increasing the load you use with a certain rep range. Another alternative is to use slower repetition tempos. The current evidence suggests individual rep tempos in the range of 0.5 to 8 seconds can be similarly effective for building muscle. So as opposed to training with higher rep ranges with fairly normal rep speeds, you could use the same light load but perform the reps with a much slower controlled tempo. Again, feel free to experiment around and find what you prefer.